This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. This week, the price of regulating competition around the world. We spoke with former EU Commissioner Margrethe Vestager on her very last day on the job about what she has meant for Europe's tech industry. Plus, Ambassador Richard Haass on what President Trump will have in his geopolitical inbox when he moves back into the Oval Office next month. And a growing threat for the data at the center of our economy. How U.S. statistical agencies are grappling with shrinking budgets even before cuts to the overall federal budget. But we begin with a story about $105 trillion. That is the size of the gross domestic product of the entire world, and also the amount of money researchers tell us Americans will inherit over the next 25 years. If that seems large, that's because it is.
It's definitely the biggest number we've ever seen. We've been looking at this research for over a decade now.
Chase Horton is a senior analyst at Cerulli Associates, and he's the lead author of a new report quantifying how much wealth in the U.S. will be given out or passed on over the next 2.5 decades. It's a big jump from the number Cerulli found a few years ago, and he thinks he knows why.
It's really a confluence of three trends over the past dozen or so years. We've seen a substantial amount of wealth creation. So privately held wealth by households in the United States has increased essentially 100% since we looked at this in 2011, and that's on an inflation-adjusted basis. In addition, we also have seen wealth become increasingly concentrated among fewer wealthier households, and those wealthier households are more likely to be survived by their assets, so they're not going to be spending those assets down like the rest of us. And we've also seen wealth concentration among older households. So more wealth is held today by households that are over the age of 60 than we've seen in a long time. And it's also the highest portion, if you look at the ratio of expected wealth transfer in the next 25 years as a ratio of overall wealth held today, we see about 80% of the wealth held today going to be in motion over the course of the next 25 years. And when we first looked at this about a decade ago, that ratio was closer to 50% of assets in motion. So the ratio of wealth expected to be changing hands in the next 25 years is significant and much greater than what we even saw a decade ago.
More money getting passed down over a relatively short time. And for the 1 in 5 who receive any inheritance at all, the share of their net worth coming from that inheritance, rather than their earned income, is on the rise. A new Bloomberg analysis shows that today, your financial status has more to do with who your parents are than at any time in recent history. That inherited money now accounts for at least a quarter of the wealth for the average inheritor. But many economists think that figure is much higher, including former Treasury Secretary and Wall Street Week contributor Larry Summers.
If you count what happens when somebody gets an inheritance and then they invest it and that builds up more wealth, that probably the vast majority, certainly a majority, of the wealth in our economy is related to inheritance. And that's, of course, a complicated thing. On the one hand, family values are good. On the other hand, it's not like it's equally distributed. It's not like it's even as unequally distributed as income. It's not even like it's as unequally distributed as the rest of wealth. It's really very much a phenomenon about a very small fraction of the population.
Given how much wealth is being transferred, one might think we may see a wider distribution of that wealth as well. But don't count on it.
We constantly get asked, will this be redistributive in terms of wealth in the United States? And from what we've seen in the numbers is we don't really think that that's an expectation that people should have. You know, we see a significant amount of the wealth, over 50%, is held by high net worth households, so those that are 10 million or more in net worth, and that makes up around 2% of the population. And we expect a lot of that wealth to go to the top 2% of inheritors. So we don't really see any sort of reason or thing to make us believe that this is going to be, widely distributed beneficially for all Americans.
All that concentrated wealth being passed down echoes what the United States saw back in the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, which led President Teddy Roosevelt to call for a graduated inheritance tax on big fortunes properly safeguarded against evasion. And Andrew Carnegie, who became the richest man in the world in 1901 when he sold his steel company to John D. Rockefeller, agreed, saying, "Of all forms of taxation, this seems the wisest." In 1916, Congress enacted the federal estate tax that's been with us in some form or another ever since. But today, that tax doesn't apply to the vast majority of the $105 trillion passing hands.
I think there's a lot of good that's come in this country out of family businesses, family farms, family assets. I do think the extent to which this avoids taxation, even among the very wealthiest people, is something that is very bizarre. Your study estimated that there'll be about $2.5 trillion of wealth passing this year. The collections on the inheritance tax are only going to be about 1% of that $2.5 trillion. Of course, relatively limited inheritances shouldn't get taxed. Of course, you have to treat family farms in appropriate ways. But $2.5 trillion passing, and the vast majority of that being among 5% or 1% of the people who die, and only collecting 1% of it in taxes, I do think we can do better.
There is little reason to expect that the inheritors will pay any more in taxes under the next Trump administration. In his first term, Mr. Trump worked with Congress to cut the number of people subject to the tax to near historic lows, and in campaigning for a second term, advocated eliminating it altogether. But there is one way the great wealth transfer will reduce inequality. Women are set to inherit more money than ever before.
Enormous amounts of this are going to women because first you have to think that men and women have different life expectancies. So first the money goes to the wife.
Emily Green is head of wealth management at Ellevest, a financial firm that focuses on working with women. Wealth advisors, brokers, real estate agents, and others could be well positioned for a windfall as the wealth transfer accelerates in the next few years. And Green says she and her team have seen firsthand the shift from men to women.
And this next generation, millennials and such, there's a lot more single women there have been in prior generations. So there's a lot more women controlling the wealth as this inheritance comes down than there was previously. It's really going to change the way that we invest, spend, give, all these different types of things because women are going to get this huge amount of money.
How far along are we in the process of this wealth transfer?
We're still really early.
Until now, women have gotten a smaller share of inherited wealth than men. But Cerulli estimates that over the next quarter century, Gen Z women will become the first to receive at least half of the country's inheritance. And that, Green says, has major implications for the way that money will be spent and invested in the future.
And you have seen women tend to hire more women. Women tend to give philanthropically. Women tend to invest more in other women. They can give more politically. They can look to make sure that the people in office are reflecting them. You think about businesses. And so the more women can start their own businesses and do these things, that changes society as well. If you look at women business owner numbers, they're great entrepreneurs. If women have the money to create businesses, they can create businesses that serve them. So even think about healthcare. Healthcare, for a long time, drugs were only tested on men. And so when we think about healthcare, if women can create healthcare companies that are focusing on 50% of the population as well, you are changing things. There's a lot of opportunity within these spaces because there's a lot of companies that just aren't focusing on women and how they're actually thinking about this.
An economy that's better suited to fulfill the needs of the whole population rather than just 50% of it is certainly an improvement. But what about the 80% of Americans who don't stand to inherit anything? Will rising inequality weigh on economic dynamism? How much does it matter? Big questions and easy enough to ask. But when it comes to answering them, what's best for the U.S. economy might not be what's best for your family. And one of those will always come first. Just to push it and get a little personal here, you wrote a paper in 1981. I think you were still a PhD candidate at the time. Now you've had a very successful career, I hope done reasonably well. have a family, have a granddaughter. Have your views changed on the intergenerational transfer of wealth at sort of that late in your career as opposed to at the very beginning?
I think at the very beginning, I didn't really think of it as a personal issue at all. I thought about it as just part of understanding the savings process in the economy. Now I think about wanting to help my children, now that I have a grandchild, help my grandchild, but certainly not to the point where they're not living their own lives professionally and doing their own work is the philosophy that I have. I take advantage of the law as it is written, and I find it troubling that the law affords me as many opportunities to avoid paying taxes in completely legal ways as it does. And I think there are all kinds of changes in the estate tax law that would make that law function in a fairer and more equitable way.
Those changes are unlikely to come soon, if at all. And until they do, the economy may grow more dynastic, forcing us to come to grips with how much of our wealth is truly ours and how much we owe to future generations. Coming up, as Europe struggles to get its tech sector on the map, we examine the role that competition policy may play and the trade-offs between taking the lead in regulation and spurring innovation. That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about trade-offs. In particular, the trade-off between making sure firms don't dominate an industry and making sure that those same firms have the incentives to innovate and grow so that they can drive the economy. It's a trade-off being made differently in the US and Europe when it comes to the tech sector. Bloomberg's Max Ramsey tells us about the EU's self-assigned role as the world's regulator-in-chief.
The European economy is facing a slow agony as it struggles to compete with the US and China. So said none other than former ECB President Mario Draghi in September, pointing to sluggish growth and productivity.
Growth has been slowing down for a long time in Europe, but we've ignored it. Until 2 years ago, we would never have such a conversation as the one we're having today, because things were sort of going well. But now we cannot ignore it any longer. Now conditions have changed. Europe is nowadays stuck in a static industrial structure, populated by mid-technology companies, which are already mature. The problem is not that we lack smart people, and we don't lack certainly good ideas. But there are too many barriers to commercializing innovations and scaling them up in the European Union.
The numbers help show the scale of the gap between Europe and the US. Despite having a larger population, the European Union's GDP sits at around $19 trillion. That's compared to $29 trillion for the US. The Stock 600's market cap is about $14 trillion. Versus over $50 trillion for the S&P 500. One criticism has been that Brussels' aggressive approach to regulation, especially with big technology companies, has held corporate Europe back versus its global rivals. The person at the center of this policy for the past decade is Margrethe Vestager, the EU's former competition commissioner. We spoke to her on her final day as the bloc's top antitrust enforcer.
What that has been sort of my drive in Danish politics, in European politics, was to make sure that everybody has a fair chance of making it. And making sure that the market provides for that the market serves customers, that has been, the trend of these 10 years for me.
It's a mantra that has resulted in some of the toughest rules in the world for big tech. Another way to put it, if you can't beat Silicon Valley at its own game, regulate it. Vestager has overseen some of the EU's most high-profile cases, taking on the world's biggest companies and issuing over 25 billion euros in fines for abuses of dominance and cartel violations.
Today is a big win.
She won a record €13 billion tax judgment against Apple and oversaw one of the EU's landmark pieces of regulation, the Digital Markets Act. We asked about her rise from Danish politician to perhaps the most feared name in Silicon Valley.
I don't really know how to prepare for being on the front page of one of the US main papers. It's important to figure out how to go with it.
Fair is fair.
I came, of course, from executive positions in Denmark. I was the deputy prime minister. I had had several experiences as a minister. But I think the most important point is that you believe in what you do. That's the cases that we have fought, that they have been fought with great work by the teams with very strong evidence. I think that's the kind of preparedness that you need, that you believe that this is a strong case and you have something valuable to say.
And from her point of view, things have gotten better.
I definitely think that we have made progress. The world was different 10 years ago. How we looked at technology was very different 10 years ago. Nobody was really asking questions to say, is this really fair? Is this a good way to behave in the marketplace? That has changed completely. You know, now people have much more nuanced views. I think seeing all the good things that comes with technology, but also realizing that we really need to take care, both to make sure that the market remains open, but also that technology is not addictive, is not providing rabbit holes or dark patterns or anything else that may manipulate us as humans in ways that undermine how society works.
But today, Vestia's legacy faces a challenge from those who say regulation has hurt Europe, stopping it from creating massive technology companies to rival the US or China. We put this to Roxanne Varza, a woman at the very heart of Europe's tech scene.
How would I sum up US versus Europe regulation? Well, I mean, I think Europe definitely has the image and the reputation of always wanting to regulate, and they're good at it.
Varza is the director of Station F, a startup campus in Paris. She's also a scout for Sequoia Capital and an angel investor herself.
And I definitely think regulation does, in some cases, slow things down. It creates complexity. In some cases, it's not even clear when the regulations are first coming out exactly what they apply to and what we need to do to comply with them. So it can be quite difficult to navigate, especially for young, innovative companies that don't have a lot of resources and a lot of time to spend on that kind of thing.
All that, she says, can bring some disadvantages for companies in Europe compared to their rivals in North America.
I think in the US, there's a lot more flexibility. The consumer is potentially less protected because of those discrepancies. But as we mentioned, there's less room for innovators to play with. So I think they're two very different approaches, and I think the European approach will naturally dissuade some types of innovation from happening here.
Margareta Vestia takes a different view.
We're talking a lot these days about competitiveness. The paradox is that you can have competition without having competitiveness, but you cannot have competitiveness without competition. So really important to maintain that strive that everybody should be challenged. If you achieve a very strong market position, it comes with responsibility. So to some degree, I think a lot of people can mirror themselves in what we are asking of market participants in their own lives. If someone is rich and powerful, they have responsibility. If someone is small with very few means, well, they should have a better chance of making it.
This view has informed the flagship technology regulation for the EU and, by extension, much of the world over the past 10 years.
I think it's important here to see, well, some regulation, like the Digital Markets Act, is opening the marketplace. Regulation like the AI Act makes AI safe to use, which means, again, that it opens the market for many more use cases where people may otherwise scare off. So I think it's important to look at regulation and say, okay, that is market creating, that is market opening, that is enabling innovation. And then look at regulation where you have reporting obligations that you may not need, or that implementation have been done in a way that was overly strict, where with new technology or going through things, I would say, why did we do that in such a complicated manner? There are much easier ways to do this. So I think it's really important to do that. And the new commission has obliged itself to go through the entire body of regulation to weed out the overlaps, what is unnecessary, in order to make life easier for businesses big and small.
Station Afsavaza also says that while regulation can sometimes slow tech innovation, it can also create opportunities. And she's optimistic about the future of Europe's startup culture.
I think it's interesting we don't also talk about the opportunities that some regulations can create. And when I say this, I'm thinking specifically of climate tech, the climate tech industry. I do think that the regulation obviously is causing a lot of headache for some companies that have to comply, but it is also creating a lot more opportunity and a lot more interest for this category in Europe. I would say actually that Europe has made a huge cultural shift, maybe over the last 5 years. If I'm looking specifically at France, 10 years ago, it was definitely not a thing to be an entrepreneur. It was almost considered crazy. Why don't you go get a real job, essentially? But that has 100% changed today, and I think just about everybody wants to be a founder. So I think this cultural shift that we're seeing in France, and the rest of Europe is also catching up with it, has changed a lot of things. And when I actually look at how people build companies in the US and in Europe, I mean, obviously, structurally in Europe, things are very different. It means something very different to build a company. But the cultural, the kind of mindset of entrepreneurs is almost identical. I would say it's actually maybe become even a little bit more balanced recently. I think with AI, we've seen the US having to step in a bit more, deciding to regulate a bit more now. We'll have to see if that continues with the new presidency.
The EU's tough approach to regulation hasn't always pleased its partners. President Trump notably attacked Vestager, saying she hates the United States, perhaps worse than any person I've ever met. Now she hands over to her successor, Teresa Ribera of Spain, with massive antitrust decisions to take against American companies. Apple, Alphabet's Google, Meta, and X, owned by Trump confidant Elon Musk, could face billions in fines or even mandatory divestment orders. We asked Ribera how she hopes to deal with the new administration.
I will try to anticipate cooperative relations in these fields. I think that both American consumers and European consumers, worldwide consumers, do benefit when we pay attention on how the market does work. And I was said, and this is quite clear, that before, in the previous Trump mandate, there was also some involvement, relevant involvement and coordination between the competition policies and decisions between the two authorities. So I hope that we can work together.
As for Vestager, she may be backing away from the front lines of antitrust enforcement, but she's hardly fading away.
Well, what the future brings, I don't know. What I know is that I bought myself a domain, which is .eu. Because it may be that the European Commission is done with me, but I'm so not done with Europe.
Coming up, Ambassador Richard Haass takes us around a world of geopolitical stress as the Trump administration prepares to take the reins. That's next on Wall Street Week. President-elect Trump will face a full inbox of geopolitical issues when he takes office next month. And here to take us through that inbox is Richard Haass. He is of Centerview Partners, where he's senior counselor. He, of course, ran the Council on Foreign Relations for some 20 years. Okay, so first of all, start with what President Biden has left over for President Trump to deal with.
Well, I think what he's left, or what's in the inbox, are a lot of good relations with America's allies, who are our partners around the world. You've obviously got conflict in Europe that is unresolved. You've got a very difficult relationship with China, this country's principal, I don't know if you want to call it adversary or competitor in the world. You've got a Middle East that's gone through an extraordinarily difficult, 15 months, though we can talk about it. In some ways, there's signs of a significant strategic improvement. You've got a world that's getting warmer. You've got a world where trade relations are having difficulty because there's no longer global trade talks. The mechanisms for dealing with trade are, shall we say, impaired. And you've also got not just strong countries, in some cases, which have aligned, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But you've also got any number of weak countries in the world, David, that can't meet many of the responsibilities of being a functioning state.
A fair number of challenges in there. Let's talk about possible opportunities. Start with the Middle East that you referred to. Is there a possible opportunity for the new President Trump actually to come in and bring some peace to that region that we haven't seen?
Absolutely, and I got to tell you, David, I don't often pair the words opportunity and Middle East, so this is something of a first for me. But yeah, I could see several opportunities. Probably the most significant might be between the United States and Iran. Iran is on its heels. It's lost much of the help it got from Hezbollah, no longer poses a serious threat to Israel. Iran also has to deal with the change of regime in Syria. Hamas has militarily been grounded down. And also Israel's demonstrated its ability to attack Iran with near impunity. So I think there's a real opportunity for the United States to approach Iran and say, hey, we want to get you out of the nuclear weapons business once and for all. We want to stop your program, make it verifiable what you have and don't have. And second of all, we want to end your support for proxies, for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for the Houthis who have interfered with shipping. And if they'll do that, we can then say, then we can talk about, for example, relaxing sanctions. But I think that's a major opportunity. I think at some point also there's an opportunity to get a ceasefire in Gaza, to get many, if hopefully all of the remaining hostages back. And then it's really up to the administration, the new administration, to what extent they then want to build on any of that and try to advance the Israeli-Palestinian process.
Let's turn to Ukraine and Russia, what's going on there. Once again, is there a possible opportunity there for the incoming President Trump to actually bring an end to that war?
Once again, I'm going to surprise both of us. I think there is. I think it's poised potentially not for peace, not for a resolution of all the disputes, but for a ceasefire in place, essentially. The United States essentially is telling Ukraine, and the people around Donald Trump are telling them, we'll continue to help you, but only if you accept a ceasefire in place. Ukraine is now willing pretty much to do that. And hopefully then we can convince Mr. Putin to say essentially to him, look, we're going to continue arming Ukraine so long as they're willing to compromise. Are you willing to compromise? And maybe this combination of the war losses that Russia suffered, plus their deteriorating economy, might just set things up, again, not for peace, but for a ceasefire that would save an awful lot of lives and money and material, and among other things, allow Ukraine to start to rebuild.
The Middle East and Ukraine are important, but China, in many ways, may be the big issue, not just for next year, but for many years to come. What are the opportunities and challenges for President Trump coming in with China?
I don't see a whole lot of opportunities, I'll be honest. Sometimes in foreign policy, David, it's not what you try to accomplish, it's what you try to avoid. So I would think the real goal with China ought to be to avoid a massive trade confrontation, to avoid a flare-up or worse in the South China Sea, obviously more than anything else to avoid a war over Taiwan. If we can do all of those things and have an uneasy relationship, but still with a floor, I'll feel pretty good.
What about that trade conflict? Because obviously the incoming President Trump has made no secret of the fact he likes tariffs, and particularly high tariffs on China. Isn't he almost committed to pursuing that? Because it's not just him, it's not just Republicans. Democrats, to a large degree, have been backing that as well.
100%. And we've already got lots of tariffs and sanctions in place vis-a-vis China, in part because, among other things, the Chinese are subsidizing certain exports, electric vehicles, various batteries, and so forth. The Biden administration just applied a whole new layer of tariffs this past September. That's on top of the Trump tariffs they never got rid of over the last 4 years. Look, this is a difficult relationship. But that said, if the Chinese essentially continue to commit to export-led growth, I think it's inevitable that we are going to require all sorts of new tariffs to deal with that. And then secondly, I think you have to accept the reality that anything dealing with technology is going to be limited, whether it's investment there, their investment here, transfer of technology.
To what extent is the immigration issue we have in this country also a national security issue?
Well, it is in several ways, in terms of its all these people coming in, 8 million or so illegal people coming into the United States, or people coming in illegally over the last 4 years. It's a tremendous drain on public resources. Also, though, I think it has another effect. It's a distraction in the sense people say, how can we be active in the world when we have all these problems at home? And the answer is we have to be both, but it's much, much harder to generate political consensus for the United States leading or acting in the world if people see the domestic problems of this scale. So it feeds this retrenchment or even isolationism. So I think an open border, if you will, is problematic on its merits, but it's also problematic for its knock-on effects.
Two challenges that President-elect Trump will have in common with other global leaders are the growing influence of AI and the effects of climate change.
AI is something that's going to affect just about everything in terms of economic growth and performance, which then has a knock-on effect on geopolitics. It could directly affect geopolitics as it makes its way into weapon systems. All that said, I think the chance of having what you might call an arms control regime for AI is approximately zero. It's too much happening, it's too dynamic, it's happening in too many places, there's too many potential upsides to think that the United States and China, who are the two most important actors in this area, are going to somehow get together and say, okay, we're going to agree we can only do this and we can't do that. That's a pipe dream.
We did get to arms control and nuclear weapons after we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came close to blowing up the planet. Should what you just said give us pause that we need to get to some sort of a crisis with generative AI before we can have that kind of arms control agreement?
I don't think so. I think, again, it's too decentralized. Unlike the nuclear programs, which were highly centralized, AI is happening in so many places, much, much more difficult to corral it. Also, it's much more central to the economy. Nuclear weapons and even nuclear power were pretty off to the side. It's pretty siloed, no pun intended there. I simply don't see it as being ripe for an arms control-like framework.
Another issue that we might not normally think of as geopolitical, but is climate. Where are we on climate, and how could that impinge on our activities geopolitically?
I think climate change continues unless we come up with some new technologies that really fundamentally change the situation. It's going to generate more refugees. It's going to make all sorts of problems for where people live within certain countries. So it's going to be a factor. I think for the near term, David, it's more of an economic factor, more of a human factor than a geopolitical factor.
Global markets so far have looked past recent tensions around the globe. A 2023 J.P. Morgan Private Bank report found that investors were more concerned about geopolitical events than they were about upcoming U.S. elections, even though historically geopolitics have had little or no impact on long-term returns. But Haass thinks that business leaders and market participants can't afford to ignore these risks any longer.
Things have gone well in the markets, and things tend to go well until they don't. And a lot of the things we're talking about, even the Middle East, the conflicts there have been localized. They've not been global in their implications, and the price of oil in recent months has actually come down. The Russia-Ukraine crisis has again been pretty localized. Something between the U.S. and China over Taiwan would be, shall we say, something very, very different. I also think that a lot of the people in the business world have trouble taking what you and I are talking about and plugging it into their calculations. It doesn't easily fit with a deck or something like that. Which is odd because they've just gotten through COVID. They've seen what happened with interruption in supply chains and so forth. But I think they're coming around to it. More and more firms, quite honestly, have done I work with Centerview partners. You're seeing other firms beginning to, one way or another, tap into geopolitical expertise. I think it's harder and harder to think of the business world operating apart from politics. We talked about the U.S. and China on technology. If you're in that business and China is an important market for you, there's no way you can operate, much less plan, apart from thinking about the geopolitical considerations that'll affect Chinese policy as well as American policy.
Coming up, numbers make the world of Wall Street go round. But the reliability of those numbers may be at risk as we continue to cut government costs. That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about numbers. Here at Bloomberg, numbers are our business. They move markets and help us understand the economy. And so we need them to be timely and accurate. Our colleague Molly Smith tells us about the risk of not getting the numbers that we need.
One of President-elect Donald Trump's earliest priorities when he steps back into the Oval Office in January will be shrinking the government by cutting regulations, spending, and headcount.
Haass, what is Doge?
This is an important day. It's the beginning of a journey. You've heard what Doge is all about, the Department of Government Efficiency. It's a new thing, and this is a new day in Washington and a new day in America.
A slimmed-down federal government could present a threat to a handful of statistical agencies that have been sounding the alarm on their cash crunch for years. The Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics are all under financial strain. The BLS collects and analyzes U.S. employment data, and it lays claim to what could be the single most important piece of information in the world of finance, the monthly jobs report.
Every year, BLS lost purchasing power, right? Salaries for the workers were going up, but the budget was not.
Erica Groshin is intimately familiar with the BLS's fight for funding. She served as its commissioner under President Obama from 2013 to 2017.
You start almost 2 years beforehand, right? So you've got one budget kind of in process and you're pulling together the next year's budget. The department sends that budget to OMB, and from all of the departments, so the Department of Commerce, Labor, et cetera, the OMB helps the White House pull together what's called the President's budget. Then it goes to the House and to the Senate, and each of those appropriations committees winnows it down further. So it's a long, drawn-out, complicated process where you're continually giving up on ideas that and necessities that you really wanted to be funded.
The BLS, Census Bureau, and the BEA had a combined $2.2 billion budget last year, just 0.03% of federal spending. After adjusting for inflation, BLS funding has slumped almost 20% since 2010.
Congress, unlike its predecessors in the 19th century, has lost sight, in my opinion, of the value of the statistical system.
Andrew Reamer at George Washington University has been researching the role of policy in agency funding for 20 years.
Back in the day, 200 plus years ago, the primary customer for the data was Congress. There was no internet. The data if it was published way late. No one could really use it. Our world has changed, and so we're on Wall Street Week. The first Friday of every month, the stock market does something on the basis of the numbers that come out on Friday morning regarding unemployment and jobs. The Fed needs that data. The second thing that happens when that data come out the first Friday of the month is that Chairman Powell goes in front of the cameras and says what it means for the Fed cutting or not cutting interest rates. Up the street from me is a Target. Target relied on census data to determine it's going to be in my neighborhood. Every business, every retail business, every factory uses federal data to figure out where it's going to invest and how much it's going to invest. If those data are bad, companies lose money.
The data isn't just important on paper, it has real market consequences, which we saw play out when a weaker than expected print helped trigger a $6.4 trillion global wipeout in August.
Well, here is a downside surprise that's going to catch the market's attention. 114,000 jobs created last month, according to the BLS.
Michael Collins at PGIM Fixed Income sees the difference in the quality of the data and the effect it has on how he makes his investment decisions.
The data is probably less reliable today than it's been. But that being said, we have so much more data, right, than we've ever had. I mean, you think back, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and you look at the old newspaper clippings. I mean, the limited amount and the poor timeliness of the data. People are still managing money and making, big investments on those releases. Today, we're actually, have the benefit of having so much macro data, micro data, contemporaneous data, leading data, lagging data, and so we have the flexibility to put it all together and try to, paint a bigger picture. We're really looking, at each piece of data as a component to the bigger picture. Does it support our thesis, or does it, make us think twice about our thesis and maybe pause before we put on a trade or an investment that will benefit from our view. And by the time you get the revisions, right, that it is so backward looking that it doesn't reflect market behavior going forward, right? The markets are very forward-looking beasts, as you know. They will take each data point and try to extrapolate the trend up or down on any of these different indicators or series. So when you do a revision, all it does is kind of reset maybe the level, but it doesn't really change the forward-looking trend. So either way, the data to investors like us, long-term investors, are not that important. What's important is how the markets are going to respond to activity in the future. So we're always trying to stay, obviously, one step ahead of the data, right? To try to take the data and, again, try to paint a picture of the direction of these different indicators. And we will certainly make investments and put on trades and put on positions that we think are consistent with our view on which way the data is pointing. If you get a revision, by then, it's really moot.
In August of this year, the BLS found itself unprepared to handle a delay in releasing a scheduled revision to its jobs data. The figures were finally released about 30 minutes after they were supposed to come out, but not before a handful of firms, including BNP Paribas and Mizuho, got the numbers because they called the BLS and asked. The fallout from the glitch was made worse by the massive revision, highlighting another issue plaguing the BLS and other statistical agencies: declining response rates to surveys.
Because response rates are falling, then you're not actually getting 60,000 households every month, right? You're getting substantially less than that. And so you're really missing out on smaller groups, racial groups, industry groups, veterans, etc. If you want to know what's going on with the various groups, the information just won't be as good. Response rates are falling for all surveys all across the world, all kinds of surveys. There's what's called in the field, it's called survey fatigue. So people get a lot of requests, and when it first started, there were very few surveys. And another factor in all of this has been the demonization of government.
Grosjean says the lack of trust in the government and its data creates a feedback loop of low response rates and inaccurate data.
So conversion of the top ranks of the staff in the statistical agencies to political appointees threatens to undermine trust in the agencies. And when you undermine trust, you interfere with their ability to fulfill their mission.
When it comes to setting monetary policy, putting myself in the Fed's position, they have the same problem as investors do. They're looking at the data. They're looking at a really broad set of data. They're looking at the data over time. But as Powell just said recently in an interview, we are managing monetary policy based on the economy, how the economy is behaving now. Right? But if you don't know how the economy is behaving now because you can't rely on the data and you're susceptible to a lot of revisions, that makes their job very difficult as well.
If you had come here a few years ago, these streets didn't exist.
Zach Brandon and Aaron Olver saw firsthand how data from statistical agencies turned into cash for their hometown of Madison, Wisconsin.
It really started earlier in 2005, 2004, but the report that I think set the groundwork for what came out of the CHIPS Act was this the study that came from Brookings in 2019. They looked at population, they looked at types of jobs, they looked at share of bachelor's degrees, they looked at STEM R&D investments, they looked at PhDs per capita. So all that is federal data that's collected, and so those data sets become important to put together the composite.
15 Wisconsin companies specializing in healthcare technology, as well as higher education institutions, came together last year to seek the designation as a so-called tech hub under the CHIPS and Science Act. The state earned $49 million in federal funding, which is expected to create $9 billion worth of economic development and more than 30,000 jobs.
There's sexy headlines, and then there's discernible data, right? And so you have to look past the headlines, and you also have to look past scale. Because if you just looked at size, if you just said, well, who has the most of these employees, you would just stay in those 5 cities, you'd go to New York, wherever there was scale. But what you're really looking for is a bit of a needle in the haystack. You're looking for density. What you're looking for is, where is this bubbling up now? And that if you could add an accelerant to it, so where has the spark occurred? And if we could add an accelerant, where will it catch fire? What are the solutions to global challenges that the US can develop? So health being one of those. So personalized medicine, thinking about biohealth is going to be a big part of the future economy in this country. So where are those companies? Where does that research exist? And I think that's what you saw in this technology hub that's developed within Wisconsin, is that if you start in Milwaukee and you make your way to Madison, you've got more than 100 companies that touch health in some way. And some of the largest companies in the world that are doing health care, health delivery, health research, health R&D happen to be based in this corridor. But if you weren't looking at data, you wouldn't have noticed that.
Brandon says that despite his city's rapid tech growth, it could stumble without federal support, and other cities could miss out on future investment if statistical agencies continue to lose resources.
It's really hard to be the dominant innovation economy in the world. It's not that hard to undo it, right? And slowly ticking away, knocking off pieces of what got us here will set us certainly on a downward trajectory. And so if you're worried about global competitiveness, if you're worried about understanding China's rise in innovation and matching that against the US rise in innovation, you need data to be able to understand what the future looks like.
Understanding that future as best we can will always be valuable, no matter whose data we use to do it. So if the government can't survey and put out its own figures, can the private sector pick up the slack? Erica Groshin says it's not so simple.
It's a huge opportunity, but it's not a substitute. Why? A private sector company would never have the incentive to create the long history of data that the statistical agencies do that really help you to put current conditions in perspective. They don't have the incentive to be as transparent as the statistical agencies do about their methodology and to do all of the background research to be sure they're getting it right. Their focus is on get it out fast, get it, innovate, and all of that is great. But you need to have the really reliable information whose sourcing you really know to judge the quality of all of these cool new innovative products. And many of these companies really work hand in hand with the statistical agencies and are supporters of them.
For now, government data and private surveys continue to go hand in hand. But no matter who generates them, good numbers will always cost money. The question is, do we value them enough to keep paying the bill?
Coming up, Richard Haass returns to give the United States a report card for how it did in the civics exam it's just taken. The U.S. presidential election we've just experienced put democracy to the test. How did we do? Richard Haass of Centerview Partners is author, most recently, of Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. So, Richard, as I recall, in the foreword to your book, Bill of Obligations, you say you were concerned about the future of democracy. It is a dangerous time. Are you any less concerned about democracy today than you were before the November election?
No, I remain concerned about democracy, not a panic, but concern. Look, we just had an important election. The fact that, close to 100 million Americans who are eligible to vote didn't vote, that does not exactly make me feel comfortable. The fact that a lot of Americans are voting based upon information, shall we say, that is short of being accurate or much less comprehensive. We still don't have a country that's requiring, or in many cases teaching, civics in our schools. Public service is an opportunity for not nearly enough Americans as it ought to be. I see the discourse, David. It's just so polarized. The most interesting thing going on in American society is a phenomenon that political scientists called sorting, S-O-R-T-I-N-G, where increasingly Americans are leading separate lives, separate churches, separate places they live. The red states are getting redder, the blue states are getting bluer. They're not coming into contact with Americans who have different points of view. They're listening to different or watching different cable stations or on different websites. And I worry about our ability to operate together, to compromise, to meet common problems. So yeah, I mean, we've avoided a crisis like January 6th, I get it, but no one should think that somehow the problem has passed.
So on the sorting issue, what could be done about it? Are there mechanisms we could come up with, nationally, locally, to actually make us deal with one another? Because right now, it does seem we sort of go to our respective corners and reinforce our prejudices.
Well, I think it's a good question. There's several ways to answer it. Those states where people are leaving might ask themselves, are there reasons that people are leaving? It might have something to do with taxes or the quality of public schools or some other thing. And I say that from a state known as New York, which has a real problem with those issues. So I think there's some things that, but once it happens, I mean, you can't tell people they can't move. And that's where I think expanded public service opportunities would help. Tom Brokaw used to write about the greatest generation, where people would come together, work together, in some cases die together. Obviously we don't want that, but the idea of public service, bringing people together, civics in the classrooms would also help. You know, we're a year and a half away from the 250th anniversary of this experiment. Well, what better time to have something of a national teach-in about what it is to be an American? What are not just your rights, but what are your obligations? What do you owe this country? What do you owe your fellow citizen? So it ought to be a time to do some of those things. So I think sorting is a phenomena, and what we've got to do is try to figure out ways to give Americans some common experiences to offset the silos.
I know that besides writing the book, you didn't leave it there. You followed up by trying to encourage public schools to teach civics, for example. What kind of progress are you making?
I wish I could sit here and tell you I've made enormous progress. I haven't, some because I'm doing a few other things, but it's tough. You know, school systems are very decentralized in this country, and these issues, so it's hard to break through, where the teachers are already strapped. Teacher training is not one of our strengths in this country. Teachers' unions, shall we say, can at times be something of an obstacle. We've also loaded other requirements on the schools which get in the way. There's no consensus on what we should teach. It's interesting. When it comes to civics, even federal legislation that would provide funds for this often begins with preambles that say nothing in this should be construed as suggesting this is going to be, there should be a national civics curriculum. And I read that and go, why not? If the whole idea is to knit the country together, why would we want to have kids in Oklahoma learning different stuff from kids in Arkansas? We do want a national curriculum, but it's just very hard in this divided polity of ours to reach consensus on that.
A priority, but is it a federal priority? We have President Trump about to take office, who campaigned on eliminating the Department of Education. Yeah. I mean, when you talk about having money federally for this, there's a lot of movement that say it should be left up to the states or the local government.
I hear you, and ideally it should be a federal priority if you want to have a one-size-fits-all federal curriculum so all Americans have it in common. But I take your point. We can't agree at the federal level. Things often get more done at the state and local level. Resources are there. So that to me is the second best. And I think it's going to be up to governors and others to basically say, okay, we're going to do it in our state. We're going to have public service programs, and you see it in states like California taking the lead there, and we're going to have civics programs. We're also going to have programs at the state level. You're seeing New Jersey introduced a requirement for it to teach what's called information literacy. So young people learn to navigate this flooded environment where there's information but also tremendous misinformation, and how do they know what's a quality source, what's a fact, and what's an opinion. So I think things we're going to have to do, and I take your point. I think it's going to be less difficult to get done at the state level, even if in principle it might be a second best solution.
You mentioned New Jersey and California. As you go around and really talk about this, are you seeing an openness or even an appetite at state levels? And do you see it in, if I can use the expression, in red states as well as blue states?
A short answer is I do. Most Americans know there's something amiss. When I have conversations, I've done town halls around the country and so forth. People know there's something wrong. They see it. They watch it. This is not the America, particularly older people they grew up in. It's easier to reach people of, shall we say, our generation. A little bit tougher with younger people, because in many cases they haven't seen democracy work the way it should. They associate an American role in the world stage with Iraq and Afghanistan rather than with the Gulf War or Korea or World War II. So it's a little bit harder, I find at times, to break through with a younger generation. But I think, yeah, Americans know, they get it, that something is not quite working, and we've got to fix it. We can't assume it's going to get better on itself.
There is an American problem, many people would say, on this front, but is it only an American problem? Because we are seeing democracies challenged around the world. I mean, look at South Korea, what's happened in South Korea. Look at France, look at Germany. I mean, anywhere you look, it feels like right now, democracies are really on the defensive.
Well, I'd probably separate into two things. I actually see Korea as a good example of democracy, how resilient it is. You had a president who overreached with martial law, the parliament pushed back, the people pushed back. I actually take that as a good sign. I would say in a lot of the world, it's not so much democracy that's in trouble. It's a bad time to be an incumbent. Because if, say, take Great Britain, there you had the incumbents pushed out, but they were, it was a conservative government that lost, and a Labor government came in. And much of the rest of the world, the rotation has been in the other direction, including in ours. And then I think the challenge is for the new crowd to make democracy work. And then they'll be tested. We'll have a midterm in 2 years. We'll have a new presidential election in 4 years. Germany, France are going through some terrible difficulties. Japan is going through a difficult succession. We'll see what happens in Mexico with the new president there. Again, I think it's very hard for incumbents to defend the status quo. Most societies are saying we don't want more of the same. We want change. Populism, so you bring the new gang in, but then they're going to become the incumbents. And so long as rotations of power can continue to happen, and that's what I get a little bit less comfortable. That means you've got to have a strong media, you have to have checks and balances on political power, so if people either rule badly or rule in ways that are contrary to the law, that there's recourse, that ultimately they can and will be held accountable. And that's what's so important. That's what's really instrumental to democracy.
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. This is Bloomberg. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.